we have something very special to show you. It's a major discovery that for the last 2,000 years has been lying buried beneath volcanic rock and ash, and you are going to be the first people to see this.
When archaeologists peeled back the wetlands of eastern England, they uncovered Britain's own Pompeii, a Bronze Age settlement caught mid-disaster, preserved with eerie perfection.
This is the crown jewels in terms of what it will tell us about past humanities and about the way people lived in this landscape 3,000 years ago.
Timber still bears fresh-looking axe strokes, meals remain abandoned mid-bite, and exotic treasures like Iranian glass beads sit untouched, waiting for hands that never returned.
The fact that they're containing their food suggests that the fire event took them by surprise. It wasn't planned.
What blaze tore through this thriving community nearly 3,000 years ago? And why did its people escape without taking a single possession?
And when the archaeologists started excavating the site, they found these empty spaces and they filled them in with plaster. And you can actually see the features of these bodies.
The discoveries emerging from this drowned village are rewriting everything we thought we understood about the Bronze Age, and its secrets promise to reshape history itself. Britain's version of Pompeii. The wetlands of eastern England have a strange way of holding their breath. Step into them and the world feels muffled, as if sound itself sinks into the peat. But beneath those quiet waters, time doesn't pass. It waits. It waits for thousands of years, packing secrets into layers of dark, oxygen-starved mud. So when quarry workers cut a little too deep at Must Farm, the earth finally exhaled. And what it released wasn't a scatter of broken pottery or the faint outline of a post hole. It was an entire moment, a full, living moment, from 3,000 years ago. Archaeologists ask bold questions. What did Bronze Age families eat? How did they dress? What scared them? But they never expect clear answers. Time is usually too messy, too stingy. Except this time, time had been frozen. Roughly 80 miles north of London, Chris Wakefield leaned over the excavation trench and stared at something that should not have existed. The timber beam in front of him, charred, collapsed, perfect, was nearly 2,850 years old, and yet every groove carved by an axe looked freshly made. The cuts still caught sunlight the way a carpenter's work does before the wood dries. Wakefield blinked once, twice. Surely this was a trick of the mud, a lucky coincidence of shadows. Bronze Age sites simply don't preserve like this. Except this one did. Most excavations offer hints. A faint stain where a post once stood, a few tired shards of pottery if you're fortunate, a cluster of animal bones if the archaeology gods are in a good mood. But Must Farm refused to play by the rules. It didn't whisper, it shouted. As the team brushed away peat and silt, roundhouses began emerging with their walls intact. Not theoretical outlines, not guesses, but real structures. The roofs had collapsed inward, forming perfect negative molds of the rooms beneath. Tools still hung on their original hooks. It felt like someone had shouted, "Fire!" and an entire community had stepped outside, fully expecting to return. One house offered the kind of discovery archaeologists joke about, but never actually anticipate. A wooden spoon resting in a bowl of porridge, half-eaten, still clumped, still clinging to the shape of the last mouthful. Wakefield, part of the Cambridge Archaeological Unit's 55-person team, called the site Archaeological Nirvana. And he wasn't exaggerating. The 1.4 million pound excavation revealed something unbelievable. A settlement on stilts, perched over a shallow, slow-moving river in the Fenlands. Whoever built this place knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the landscape, trusted the river, and felt secure enough to raise families above the water's edge. But security doesn't always last. Sometime around 850 BC, likely in the thick heat of late summer, something went catastrophically wrong. Fire tore across the settlement faster than anyone could respond. And then nature did something extraordinary. As each burning structure collapsed, it fell straight into the wet river mud beneath. The flames smothered instantly. Oxygen vanished. Decay stopped. Everything, every spoon, every bead, every tool, became trapped in a perfect, airless coffin of silt. A disaster had become preservation. For nearly 3 millennia, the settlement slept beneath layers of peat until 20th century quarrying clipped part of it and woke it. When archaeologists arrived, they quickly realized this wasn't just another Bronze Age dig. This was Britain's version of Pompeii, except instead of volcanic ash, the preservative was water and mud. Still, the effect was the same. Life stopped mid-motion and remained that way. The comparison wasn't dramatic, it was accurate. Pompeii showed a Roman city frozen at the moment of eruption. Must Farm showed a Bronze Age community suspended in the instant fire consumed it. And like Pompeii, it answered questions researchers had been asking for decades. How did these people organize their homes? Where did they work, sleep, cook, trade, and store their goods? The answers were everywhere. The architecture was sophisticated. The rooms were organized with surprising consistency. There were tools for woodworking, cooking, textile production, every one of them exactly where it had last been used. There were beautifully woven fabrics that shouldn't have survived even a century, much less 30. There were imported treasures that hinted at global trade networks. There were personal objects that made the people of Must Farm feel less like abstract ancestors and more like neighbors. And beneath that stillness, beneath the layers of collapsed walls and domestic chaos, lay something even more rare: clarity. Archaeologists don't get clarity. They get puzzles missing 90% of their pieces. Must Farm delivered the whole box. The site shook the archaeological world. It challenged long-held beliefs about Bronze Age life in Britain, revealed technology more advanced than expected, and painted a vivid portrait of families who were skilled, connected, and far from primitive. And yet, among all the tools and timbers and textures of everyday life, one item, the most ordinary of objects, carried the greatest emotional weight of all: a breakfast someone never had the chance to finish. The breakfast left behind. You don't just look into a Bronze Age roundhouse at Must Farm. You step into it like someone forgot to lock the door 3,000 years ago. The moment archaeologists ducked inside, they found a room that felt strangely familiar, a central hearth glowing only in memory, woven floors that once cushioned bare feet, storage racks still hanging on to their last tasks. Dust-fine ash clung to everything like frost, catching the light in a soft haze. And there, right beside the collapsed hearth platform, sat the bowl. A bowl of porridge, frozen mid-meal. Not metaphorically, literally. The wheat grains were still clumped together, glued with animal fat. The wooden spoon was resting beside it, as if its owner had simply paused to answer a question, except they never came back. It was the sort of find that makes the excavation team go silent in that stunned, reverent way archaeologists get when time suddenly feels too close. But the bowl held an even more intimate detail: fingerprints. The maker's fingerprints, pressed into the clay before the bowl ever met a fire. Maybe they belonged to a potter with steady hands or a teenager learning the craft. Whoever they were, they accidentally left their identity on an object that outlived kingdoms, empires, religions, and the entire notion of history itself. Scientists talk about collapsing the distance between past and present, but here it wasn't a metaphor, it was a tangible fact. Touching the bowl meant touching the hands of someone who lived and breathed 800 years before Rome even existed. Once the team recovered from the emotional punch of that realization, the real detective work began. The porridge itself, simple at first glance, turns out to have been anything but plain. Under chemical analysis, the mixture revealed a little surprise: honey mixed with deer meat. Suddenly, this wasn't just breakfast. This was a recipe. This was culinary flair. Researchers couldn't resist calling it a prehistoric version of honey-glazed venison. And honestly, that's exactly what it was. It shattered the stereotype of Bronze Age people gnawing on bland grains and unseasoned boiled meat. These families understood flavor. They experimented. They combined textures and aromas. Their meals weren't desperate survival rations. They were intentional, thoughtful, and surprisingly sophisticated. And then comes the human part. Who was eating this breakfast? A child? A parent? An elder warming their hands by the fire? Whoever it was, they were relaxed enough to sit down for a morning meal. Maybe they were halfway through a conversation. Maybe they were planning the day's work, tending animals, weaving cloth, repairing tools. And then something outside snapped their attention so violently that they dropped everything. The spoon, still angled toward the bowl, tells a story of panic. No one sets down a spoon like that unless they intend to run. That unfinished meal is a symbol of something bigger. Ordinary lives interrupted in a single terrifying moment. Across the settlement, that same suddenness was everywhere. In one house, archaeologists uncovered 128 ceramic vessels, cups, bowls, jars, and heavy cooking pots, some stacked neatly like they'd just been washed and put away. Wooden items survived too, which is almost unheard of. Boxes carved from willow and maple, bowls still holding their shape. 40 bobbins where the weavers left them, threads still attached. And then there was a single bucket, flipped over and scarred with knife marks. Someone had used it as a cutting board, an improvisation so wonderfully human it feels modern. Wakefield, supervising part of the dig, said moments like that made the past feel disturbingly alive. And he wasn't exaggerating. Even the textiles, flax linen woven with such precision that the hems were neat, the seams straight, the surfaces soft, suggest a level of domestic skill that feels more Renaissance than prehistoric. But life wasn't just practical. It was meaningful. It was decorated. Even the waste piles told stories. Dog droppings showed the family pets lived on scraps from the table. Human coprolites contained parasite eggs. Nothing romantic about that, but incredibly informative. Animal bones showed meals of lamb, deer, pike, and bream. This wasn't a starving community. This was a thriving one. Everything suggested life was unfolding normally, until it wasn't. And just when archaeologists thought they understood what they were dealing with, a new realization hit them. This settlement hadn't even existed long enough to eat a year's worth of breakfasts. 9 months to build a world. The thing about archaeology is that you expect mess, layers, centuries piled on top of each other like a badly shuffled deck of cards. So when the Must Farm team realized the settlement had no layers at all, they didn't believe it at first. It wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. The evidence was everywhere once they noticed it. The waste piles were tiny, almost shy. The wooden posts were still green, their cells swollen with sap. Even the insects, nature's cleanup crew, hadn't moved in. And then came the conclusion that made the team stop cold. This city had existed for less than a year. Not decades, not generations. 9 months, maybe fewer. No one had ever seen anything like it. Archaeologists are used to villages that feel like old diaries, entries written and rewritten across lifetimes. But Must Farm? It was a single page. A settlement fully formed, thriving, and then erased in what felt like one violent breath. Inside each roundhouse, the story became even stranger. Every home contained nearly identical toolkits, like 4 households following the same shopping list. Harvesting sickles leaned against walls, waiting for the next crop. Woodworking axes and carving gouges lay exactly where they were last used. Razor-sharp blades, some for grooming, others for textiles, rested in tidy clusters. These weren't ceremonial treasures or prized heirlooms. They were the equivalent of "where did I leave my scissors" tools. The everyday gear of families who had work to do, meals to cook, and hair to trim. The sheer number of bronze objects shattered the old assumption that metal was rare or hoarded by elites. Clearly, bronze flowed into Must Farm the way charging cables flow into modern homes, quietly, steadily, without fuss. And that raised an even bigger revelation. This society was mobile, skilled, and extraordinarily well supplied. You don't build stilt houses this sophisticated in a few months unless you've done it before. These families didn't wander into the wetlands as pioneers. They arrived like people who had done this a dozen times, families who knew exactly how to establish a household from scratch. The roundhouses themselves were evidence of that confidence. Even the entranceway, a squared structure jutting from the circular houses, showed advanced planning. And all this in a settlement less than a year old. When the long-awaited 1,600-page research report came out, the academic world blinked hard. Mike Parker Pearson of UCL, usually sparing with superlatives, called the project exceptional. This wasn't just a good site. It was a rewrite button for Bronze Age Britain. The layout of the interiors added even more depth. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. These households knew exactly what they were doing, which made the final mystery even stranger. If they were so skilled, so organized, so well-equipped, if their homes were sturdy enough to last decades, if their networks were strong enough to replace lost goods, why did they never return? The fire destroyed the upper structures, but left the foundations solid. The river still flowed. The land remained usable. They could have rebuilt. They didn't. Not a single footprint, shard, or tool shows anyone ever came back. For 9 months, a community built a world on stilts, prosperous, comfortable, and connected. Then one fire erased it, and fear, or something even stronger, kept every survivor away for the next 3,000 years. And yet, as haunting as that silence is, the next discovery would raise the stakes even higher. Because Must Farm didn't just contain household tools, it contained weapons, and not the kind kept for hunting. The stack of spears. The first real clue that something was off came from a pile of weapons no one expected to find. Near one of the collapsed roundhouses, archaeologists uncovered a stack of spears, but not the sort you'd use for hunting deer or boar. These monsters stretched over 10 feet long, far too unwieldy for stalking prey through the marsh. They were built for one purpose: fighting other people. Suddenly, this quiet little Bronze Age settlement didn't seem so peaceful anymore. Warfare wasn't unusual in Bronze Age Britain. Groups clashed over territory, over grazing rights, over shiny things moving along river trade routes. Still, finding an entire arsenal sitting neatly by a domestic home raised eyebrows. Were the villagers gearing up for war? Had enemies marched across the fen? Why did a farming community need spears long enough to turn anyone into a human kebab from half a field away? And then came the second clue, the perimeter. Encircling the settlement was a defensive fence that felt less like a rustic boundary and more like something out of a military fort. Each stake rose roughly 6 feet high, sharpened to a clean, deliberate point. If you wanted to keep curious animals out, you'd weave simple wattle. But if you wanted to keep people out, you built something like this, a ring of teeth around your village. The message was clear. Someone at some point thought danger was coming. But the real story wasn't just in the weapons or the fence, it was in the fire. To understand what happened, the Cambridge team brought in a forensic fire specialist, Dr. Carl Harrison, one of the few people who can read charcoal the way others read crime scenes. Every beam, every blackened post, every direction a plank fell pointed toward what the blaze had done and how it had moved. If this had been arson, they expected to find the usual fingerprints, focused burn zones, structural weakening, accelerants, signs someone had forced their way in before lighting the place up. Instead, nothing. No broken palisades, no kicked-in doors, no smashed shields or scattered weapons, and strangely, no bodies, not a single person. It was the kind of absence that makes archaeologists stare at the ground and quietly swear. Most Bronze Age sites give you scraps, a handful of puzzle pieces from an 800-piece box. Must Farm was different. It preserved hundreds of pieces, an archaeological jackpot sealed in river silt. And yet, the most important piece, the moment the fire started, remained maddeningly out of reach. But what they could see was the aftermath, and it was chilling. The villagers fled so fast they didn't even bother to grab their valuables. Tools still hung neatly on their pegs. A wooden spoon sat in a half-eaten bowl of porridge, as though breakfast had been interrupted by someone yelling, "Run!" Livestock were found dead in their pens, never released, never saved. Whatever happened, it happened fast. Too fast for second chances. If this had been a slow burn, an ember catching on a roof, a cooking pot tipping over, someone would have opened the pens. Someone would have returned to grab jewelry or weapons. They didn't. Summer dryness might have accelerated the fire. A fallen lamp or a stray hearth spark could have turned thatched roofs into instant fuel. And yet, the presence of so many long spears, stacked neatly, untouched, added a layer of unease. Why arm yourselves so heavily if everything is perfectly peaceful? Why build a palisade tall enough to intimidate your neighbors? Fear doesn't appear out of nowhere. It comes from lived experience. But the strangest thing of all? There was nothing to indicate an attack. No bodies in defensive positions. No charring that suggested deliberate ignition. No evidence the fence was broken, climbed, pushed, or breached. If enemies came, they left no footprints. If raiders struck, they took nothing. If a battle was fought, it left no scars on the dead. Because there were no dead. So, researchers were forced to consider something else. Maybe this wasn't an attack at all. Maybe the fire was accidental, tragic, sudden, but purely natural. Maybe the villagers escaped, regrouped somewhere else, and chose never to return to the place where they'd watched their world burn. Fear can do that. Trauma can do that. Still, those spears nag at the imagination. 10-foot shafts, balanced for battle, crafted with skill far beyond everyday hunting needs. Why did a small riverside community have so many? What exactly were they expecting? The archaeologists will likely never know who lit the first spark, or whether it was intentional, accidental, or ritual. But one thing remains certain. The people of Must Farm lived with tension in their bones. They built defenses, they kept weapons, and when disaster came, whatever its cause, they vanished into the landscape, leaving their fears, their tools, and their questions behind. And among those ashes lay something else, objects that had traveled far beyond Britain's shores. The necklace that redrew the Bronze Age map. Sometimes it's the smallest objects, the things you almost overlook in the dirt, that completely rewrite history. At Must Farm, that moment arrived in the form of a necklace. Not gold, not silver, just a humble string of beads sitting quietly in the debris of a burned roundhouse. But once researchers examined it, the entire story of Bronze Age Britain tilted on its axis. The necklace wasn't tucked away in a chest or hidden beneath a floorboard. It lay right among the charred wooden beams, fallen thatch, and collapsed pottery of a home that clearly never had a chance to be evacuated. To the untrained eye, the beads looked ordinary, maybe even plain, but under the microscope, they came alive. Some were amber, warm, honey-colored, and unmistakably Scandinavian. Others were glass, crafted not in Europe, not even in the Mediterranean, but far to the east in Iran, with one rogue bead traced all the way back to Egypt. Imagine that for a second, a small family living on stilts above a marsh in eastern England, wearing jewelry made from materials that traveled thousands of miles across some of the most complex trade routes of the ancient world. So much for the idea that Bronze Age Britain was some foggy, isolated island at the edge of civilization. The more archaeologists sifted through the ash, the clearer it became. This was not a lonely settlement scraping by on barley, fishing, and good luck. Must Farm was plugged into an international network that stretched from the Baltic to the Near East. Goods moved, ideas moved, and, clearly, people moved. If someone 3,000 years ago had drawn a map of their world, Britain wouldn't have been a forgotten corner. It would have been a stop on the Bronze Age Expressway. And that necklace? It was basically a souvenir rack of the ancient world. The amber almost certainly made its way down from Denmark or southeastern Scandinavia, traveling through the famous amber routes that connected the Baltic to Central and Western Europe. Traders, who were probably much tougher than any of us, carried it south along rivers, across forest paths, and through tribal territories. From there, it jumped into the hands of middlemen, eventually reaching communities like Must Farm. The glass beads had an even wilder journey. Bronze Age glassmaking wasn't a craft you could learn in your backyard. It came from specialized workshops in Iran and Egypt, places with high heat, skilled artisans, and access to rare raw materials. Those beads likely passed from merchant to merchant, from boat to wagon, across deserts and mountains, before finally landing in a roundhouse in Britain. Not bad for items the size of blueberries. Trade wasn't just about moving shiny things. It was about moving knowledge. Pottery styles at Must Farm showed design influences from regions hundreds of miles away. A potter in the fens might have copied a decorative swirl seen on a vessel brought from across the channel. Ideas traveled just as easily as beads, and the household goods were telling the same story. Every single roundhouse, every one, contained bronze tools. Bronze doesn't happen by accident. Its ingredients, copper and tin, don't exist together naturally in Britain. The moment you pick up a bronze axe, you're holding proof that someone traded for materials, shipped them across great distances, and trusted skilled metallurgists to forge them. That Must Farm's families had multiple bronze objects each means one thing. These trade networks worked, smoothly, reliably, regularly. Luxury goods weren't tucked away in elite halls. They were sitting in everyday homes. That alone forces archaeologists to rethink their assumptions. Instead of rigid hierarchies with wealth locked at the top, Bronze Age Britain might have been more open, more fluid, more cosmopolitan than anyone imagined. The burnt village revealed a world that wasn't waiting for civilization to arrive. It was already part of it. The finds didn't stop at amber and Iranian glass. There were beads made from shale, siltstone, tin, and even faience, a glazed ceramic usually associated with Egypt. One bead, a teardrop-shaped lump of raw glass, was probably a waste product from a Near Eastern workshop. The fact that it ended up in Cambridgeshire is nothing short of astonishing. Prehistoric jewelry expert Alison Sheridan summed it up perfectly. The discovery was absolutely thrilling, not just for its beauty, but for the story it told, a story of connections that reached far beyond Britain's marshlands. And then there was the amber bead, the one that shouldn't have survived at all. Amber burns easily, and yet there it was, slightly charred but intact, having made the trip from Scandinavia, possibly shaped in Ireland, only to be lost in a fire 3 years ago and rediscovered by modern hands. Objects like these don't just hint at trade, they scream it. So, what's the big picture? Bronze Age Britain wasn't a cultural backwater. It was part of a vibrant, interconnected world in which goods, technology, and aesthetics traveled astonishing distances. Must Farm's residents lived on water, tended to their daily chores, raised animals, cooked meals, and wore jewelry with ingredients from 3 different continents. But as dazzling as these imported luxuries were, they weren't the settlement's greatest feat. Because while their beads and baubles crossed oceans and deserts, their real genius lay beneath their feet, or rather, beneath their floors. A city that floats. If you picture the Bronze Age as mud huts on soggy fields, Must Farm is here to correct you, gently but firmly. This wasn't a settlement clinging to dry land. It was a floating city, perched elegantly above a slow-moving river, its homes lifted on stilts like a prehistoric Venice. You almost expect gondolas to drift by. Each house was anchored on massive timber posts, driven deep into the riverbed. These weren't random logs hammered in at hopeful angles. The builders understood exactly what they were doing. They chose tree species that resisted rot, especially in constantly wet conditions. They calculated the spacing so the platforms wouldn't sag. They accounted for the movement of water, the shifting of currents, and the need for stability during storms. They weren't eyeballing these measurements. They were applying generations of engineering knowledge. And the benefits? Oh, there were plenty. A stilted home stays above floods, something you appreciate when you live in a landscape that's basically a marsh with ambition. The height also kept pests at bay. Fewer rats, fewer insects, fewer unexpected reptilian visitors slithering in to borrow warmth. And on hot days, cool air circulated beneath the floors, acting as natural climate control long before air conditioning was a glint in anyone's imagination. Plus, if you needed to go anywhere, the river was your driveway. Boats were the Bronze Age pickup trucks, but the engineering brilliance didn't stop with the stilts. The buildings themselves were roundhouses, and that shape wasn't chosen because someone liked circles. Roundhouses distribute stress evenly, meaning strong winds slide around them instead of punching through one vulnerable wall. Rain rolls off the thatch in every direction. Heat settles into the center and stays there. Even modern structural tests show that a roundhouse can outperform many square designs. Bronze Age architects weren't just practical, they were efficient. Archaeologists used to picture these structures as rustic, wobbly huts. Must Farm politely disagreed. The preserved walls showed tight weaving patterns, creating wattle panels that were strong, flexible, and surprisingly elegant. Every post carried tool marks that revealed how the builders shaped it for its specific role, some carved for load-bearing, others trimmed for joinery. When experts examined the construction techniques, they found carpentry as sophisticated as anything from medieval Europe. These weren't amateurs figuring things out as they went. These were specialists working within a long, refined tradition. Inside, the roundhouses were carefully zoned, almost like floor plans from an ancient IKEA catalog. Kitchens sat in the east, catching the morning light, the perfect spot for grinding grain or stirring porridge before the sun climbed high. Storage and weaving areas lined the south and southeast walls where daylight remained strong throughout the day. Sleeping areas curled around the darker, quieter northwest, far away from livestock pens and cooking fires. Families didn't just live here, they organized their lives here. Even the defenses reflected smart design. A square entranceway controlled who could approach the settlement, while a sharpened palisade of stakes, standing more than 6 feet tall, encircled everything. It wasn't a flimsy fence. It was a carefully engineered perimeter meant to keep danger out while keeping children, animals, and boats safely in. Every element showed purpose. Every design choice carried meaning. What Must Farm revealed to archaeologists was staggering. These builders weren't adapting on the fly. They were applying knowledge polished by ancestors before them. As the Bronze Age climate shifted and wetlands expanded across Britain, many groups retreated to higher ground. Not the Must Farm communities. They stayed. They innovated. They built upward instead of moving outward. They weren't at the mercy of the landscape. They shaped their lives around it. Their homes stood strong for months and could have lasted years, decades even, if not for the fire that cut everything short. Nothing about the construction suggests fragility. The engineering was reliable. The materials were chosen with care. The layout was efficient. The architecture was tested and proven. In every charred beam and water-darkened post, archaeologists saw the work of a society that didn't simply survive the Bronze Age. They mastered it. They understood their wetlands intimately, turning challenge into opportunity, risk into resilience. And yet, for all the precision and brilliance of their construction, Must Farm was still more than a blueprint on stilts. Beneath the engineering and the tools and the trade goods was something deeper, something human. Because amid the posts and pottery and finely woven walls, one object reminded archaeologists that this wasn't just architecture. It was a home, a community, a place where people lived, loved, celebrated, and grieved. And something found in the ashes would prove that with startling clarity. The skull that made the past personal. Among the hundreds of pots, tools, and textiles, archaeologists stumbled upon something that stopped them cold. A human skull, nestled incongruously among everyday household items. This wasn't a burial. There were no graves, no ceremonial placement, just a skull, smoothed by centuries of touch, lying where people had clearly kept it close. It was a keepsake, a reminder of someone they loved and had lost. And suddenly, the entire story of Must Farm shifted. Until that moment, The settlement had been a marvel of engineering, trade, and daily life frozen in amber. But the skull made it personal. It bridged the millennia in a way a polished pot or imported bead could not. Behind every wooden spoon, woven textile, and carefully stacked vessel were people who lived, loved, and grieved just as we do today. They had held this skull in their hands repeatedly, worn the bone smooth through familiarity, and felt the same pangs of memory that still resonate across time. For Mark Knight and the excavation team, the discovery was haunting. The skull reinforced that feeling, turning abstract history into real human presence. The thousands of artifacts at Must Farm reveal incredible technical skill: carpentry, textile weaving, bronze metallurgy, and even far-reaching trade networks. But the skull revealed something equally vital: the emotional world of these families. They had incorporated reminders of lost loved ones into the heart of their homes, rather than placing them in distant cemeteries. The act of touching, carrying, and displaying this object suggests a depth of feeling and a culture of memory that historians rarely glimpse in Bronze Age sites. It's easy to get swept up in the novelty of trade beads from Iran or amber from Denmark. Those objects tell us about wealth, status, and international connections. But the skull tells a different story of human attachment, mourning, and remembrance. It reminds us that these weren't just ancient engineers, traders, or farmers. They were people with families, routines, joys, and sorrows. Must Farm gives us an unprecedented look at Bronze Age domestic life, frozen in the instant of a sudden disaster. Homes meticulously arranged, possessions carefully stored, and then abandoned in haste. Fires, floods, or fear may have driven them out, leaving a perfectly preserved snapshot of daily existence. And among the remnants, the skull offers a profound emotional lens. Grief wasn't something distant or abstract. It was tangible, intimate, and deeply felt. Bronze Age Britain did see communities abandon settlements, but rarely like this. More often, villages faded over decades, fields exhausted, rivers changing course, families moving on to richer land. Houses were patched, deconstructed, or left to blend into the marshes. But sometimes, life changed in an instant. Fires blazed, waters surged, raiders struck, or winters became unforgiving. Must Farm belongs to the rare category where an entire community paused midlife, leaving behind a perfect record. Every empty doorway, every scattered tool, and yes, every keepsake tells a story. The skull stands apart from the technical details. It's a reminder that Must Farm isn't just a window into Bronze Age innovation or commerce. It's a window into human experience. Behind every well-engineered roof, every imported bead, every cooked meal, there were hearts and minds navigating the joys and sorrows of life. Love, loss, routine, and memory were as real then as they are now. As researchers pieced together kitchens, sleeping quarters, and weaving spaces, the skull added a depth no tool or trading route could provide. It humanized the narrative. It grounded the site in emotion rather than just artifacts. Yet perhaps the most haunting realization is that somewhere, beneath another field or wetland, another perfect moment might be waiting. Another settlement frozen mid-action. Another story of people who laughed, loved, and grieved. Must Farm, and especially that smooth, worn skull, reminds us that the Bronze Age wasn't just history, it was life. And life, with all its fragility and beauty, connects us across 3,000 years in ways both startling and profoundly human. And as the mud gives up its secrets, one thing becomes clear. The past isn't just a collection of objects. It's a mirror, reflecting our own lives, our loves, and our losses, waiting patiently to be discovered. And it posed questions that will never be fully answered. What caused the fire? Why was the settlement abandoned after just 9 months? Where did these families go, and what traces of their lives remain elsewhere? What's your take on this? Share your perspective in the comments section. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.